First Corinthians contains probably the earliest evidence for the resurrection of Christ, and it's actually in a creed, which goes all the way back to the event itself. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 to 8, there is a creed in those verses. And that creed was something that people memorized orally and then passed on to one another, and Paul ultimately wrote them down in 55 AD, or that creed down in 55 AD. And that creed, I don't have time to go into it now, but it's 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 to 8. Even liberal scholars agree that predates 40 AD. Some say it goes all the way back to the event itself. The Bible is not just a collection of writings, it's also a collection of oral transmission and creeds that go further back than when the books were written. Because it was an oral culture, they memorized things orally there. In fact, your ability to remember oral information was prized, unlike it is today. We don't memorize things like they did back then. They had to memorize things and did so. Now, that doesn't mean that these things were altered necessarily, because the event goes all the way back, or the creed goes all the way back to the event itself, and it was checked out by many people. So it's recorded in 55, but the evidence goes back much further, as just about all scholars agree. Now that we've established that, let's point out that if Acts is written by 62, Luke must be prior to that. Why? How do we know that? Who wrote the book of Acts? Luke. What does Luke say in the very first verse of the book of Acts? In my former work, O excellent Theophilus. Well, that's the same guy Luke is writing to in the Gospel of Luke. What's the former work to Acts? It's got to be Luke. Luke is prior to Acts. In fact, some think that Luke is actually Paul's account of what happened to Jesus. Luke's account of what happened to Jesus, and he's writing to a Roman official named easy for me to say, Theophilus, and he's writing that in order to get Paul out of trouble with the Romans. He's trying to say, look, this guy's done nothing wrong. He starts in Luke and then he continues in Acts. And in Acts he starts to travel with Paul in Acts chapter 16, because the narrative shifts from they did this, they did that, to we did this in chapter 16 of the book of Acts. If you read it, you'll see the narrative shifts. Luke is actually now traveling with Paul. Now, if Luke is there, many think Mark is prior to Luke, and of course Matthew might be prior to Mark as well. So we've got early testimony here. Also, I may be going out on a limb here, but I'd have to say that Paul wrote all of his works before he died. What do you think? You think that's a fair assessment? It may be going out on a limb, but here are the undisputed works of Paul: 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Romans, and Galatians. There are others too, but these are the main ones that will give you the evidence for the resurrection. Okay? Also, and this is the key point, I would say that most, if not all, of the New Testament's written prior to 70 AD. Why? For the same reasons I just gave you with regard to the temple and the city being destroyed. Do you know nowhere in the New Testament does it mention that the temple was destroyed? Oh, actually, it is mentioned in one place. One place. You know where it's mentioned? Jesus actually predicts it. In Matthew chapter 23 and also in Luke, in a parallel passage, he predicts that not one stone will be left upon another. When? Before this generation passes away. When did he say that? He said that probably in about 30 AD. What's a generation? 40 years. 70 AD. Yet nobody anywhere in the text says, Jesus was right. Which is telling you what? This must have been written prior to 70 AD. The key point here is that this is during the age of the eyewitnesses. It's difficult for historical revisionists to take over why the eyewitnesses are still around. It can be done, but it's difficult, especially in Jerusalem, where the leaders of the church were, and then they spread out, as you know, all over the ancient world. So we have very early testimony. You may have heard some people will date the Gospels late. First of all, when I ask the experts who look into this, guys like Gary Habermas and Mike Lacona, all with PhDs in this kind of evidence, I've asked them, why do liberal scholars date the New Testament documents, like the Gospels in particular, after 80 AD? And you know what their answer is always? They don't really give a reason. It's arbitrary. What do you think the motivation might be? Because if they date them earlier, then they have to accept them as historical eyewitness accounts, and they don't want to do that. Because then maybe this Christianity thing is true.